Welcome to Chosen People Answers, where we strive to seek truth, find God, and know Messiah. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Crawford, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Eric, Jonathan, and Jen. It is our intention on this channel to provide you with informed, sophisticated, and biblical reasons for believing in Jesus as the Messiah of Israel and Lord of the nations. Today we're talking about a subject that gets a lot of people confused. Is Jesus Jewish? There are so many misconceptions floating out there about this question. Many people know nothing about the New Testament, so they form their opinions about Jesus from afar, often thinking that he was a Christian or a Catholic or the founder of some other non-Jewish Christian sect. Since October 7th, it's been popular to make Jesus out as a Palestinian, as a freedom fighter. Others turn Jesus into a social justice warrior or some other tool for a popular agenda. All too often, Jesus becomes a Rorschach test where people project their own ideas onto him. In these cases, they use Jesus as a mirror, not for looking at Jesus himself, but rather looking at what they already believe within. But why avoid the obvious? Why avoid saying that Jesus is Jewish? Since when is the truth so controversial? So in this episode, we are going to investigate Jesus' Jewishness, cutting through the misconceptions. We're going to start by talking about the modern quest to understand Jesus in his original first century context. My colleague Jonathan here has a particular passion for historiography and the world that Jesus lived in. Jonathan, why don't you introduce us to what is historical Jesus scholarship?
Yes, historical Jesus scholars address questions assessing what we can know historically that Jesus said and did by examining the Gospels, the first century biographies of Jesus found in the New Testament. So this project of really reconstructing the life of Yeshua, of what's called the historical Jesus, it's a project that's lasted over 200 years. It began in the 18th century Enlightenment period, when there was much scientific inquiry and even scholars who want to look at the New Testament rejecting God's miracles in history. So one of the early criticisms of the scholarship on the historical Jesus that came in 1906 was from a scholar by the name of Albert Schweitzer, who wrote in his book, The Quest for the Historical Jesus. That's what it's when it was translated into English. And he says, each individual created Jesus in accordance with his own character. There is no historical task which so reveals a man's true self as the writing of a life of Jesus. The criticisms really, they held true through the decades of Jesus research, and scholars often, they would project their ideals and ethics onto Jesus. Really, whatever the scholar saw as ideal for society or the ethic that they think is so important, really, they projected that on to the person of Jesus. So their agendas really distorted the identity and teaching of the historical Jesus. Scholars would idealize Jesus and make him into even a German liberal Protestant rather than a first century Jew. So that's kind of a beginning, kind of start to the modern, or the quest that went back to 200 years ago for the quest for the historical Jesus.
Sure. So, of course, there were people who were studying who Jesus was and is before 200 years ago, but it sounds like there was a new desire to understand Jesus from a new angle that was pretty much motivated by the concerns of the Enlightenment. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. So before this study of the historical Jesus, like prior to those 200 years ago, the Gospels were really taken at face value for Christians and followers of Yeshua. So what these scholars were trying to do was to make Jesus, Yeshua, this faith, this Christianity, accessible to the modern world. And they did this through scientific inquiry of really evaluating even the credibility of a specific saying of Jesus, whether it's historical or not historical, and even kind of pushing aside miracles from taking place because trying to get in line with modern Enlightenment thinking.
Okay, so they had this scientific methodology of going about trying to figure out who Jesus was. As they went about this process, did they uncover Jesus' Jewishness? Did this process highlight his Jewishness, or was it removed from his lifestyle and his biography?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it really evolved as scholars continued to study the historical Jesus. So to answer that, I'll point to one of the most influential scholars during the quest for the historical Jesus in these kinds of discussions, Rudolf Bultmann, a German theologian. He lived between 1884 and 1976, and what he developed was a criterion for establishing whether a saying or deed of the historical Jesus or of Jesus was historical. So scholars would have these different what's called the criteria of authenticity. And one of his criteria was something called the criterion of dissimilarity. And this criterion determined that the only material that he can deem as historical, or what scholars should deem as historical in the Gospels, are ideas that do not derive from Jesus' Jewish environment or Christianity that came afterwards. So one way of putting this, in the words of Bultmann's student, Ernst Kaiserman, in 1953, he said, "In only one case do we have more or less safe ground under our feet, when there are no grounds for deriving a tradition from Judaism or for ascribing it to primitive Christianity." So the view that Jesus located himself outside of and against his Jewish heritage, it was really a primary assumption for New Testament scholarship during what's called the New Quest, 1953 to the mid-1980s. But what happened is that when scholars and theologians were reflecting after the Holocaust, their theological thinking after the Holocaust, along with new developments in the study of ancient Judaism in Second Temple Judaism, they discovered that there's really complexities within Jesus' Jewish world that they didn't know before. So with the developments in the study of the complexity and diversity of Second Temple Judaism, this really shifted scholarly thinking to seeing Jesus and understanding Jesus as belonging within Judaism. And many of the scholars who have paved the way and led the way to study Jesus in his Jewish context include both Jewish scholars and Christian scholars. So let me give you an example. This is a scholar who's a very well-known scholar writing today. He is a Jewish scholar by the name of Isaac Oliver. He says, from a historical point of view, Jesus was not a good Christian who went to church on Sunday, but a Galilean Jew who, of course, attended synagogue on the Sabbath day and never intended to establish a movement outside the parameters of Judaism. A scholar who taught for years, I think 50 years, at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, David Flusser, he says, without a doubt, Jesus and his message belong within the framework of the Judaism of his time. It is an inseparable part of it. James Charlesworth, he taught for many years at Princeton Theological Seminary. He says Jesus' devotion to Torah and Judaism is evident also in his actions. Jesus should not be imagined as the first Christian. He was a very devout Jew who observed the Torah. And Charlesworth is a Christian historian. So today in historical Jesus studies, the Jewishness of Jesus is central. It really shifted from being really taking Jesus out of his Jewish context, saying the only material we can find that we could see as historical is those that don't come from Judaism. It's actually really shifted around. The historical Jesus scholars today locate Jesus within his Jewish context. The old criterion of dissimilarity has received strong criticism, and rightly so. I mean, just think about it. To say that reliable information about Jesus must be dissimilar to Judaism is like saying the historical MLK had no association with the Black church or the civil rights movement. And almost no scholar today uses this criterion, and I'm glad that's the case. Instead, scholars are arguing that we can be more confident of the historical credibility of the reports about Jesus in the Gospels if they are contextually plausible within first century Judaism. So the problem of previous scholarship on the historical Jesus is that scholars were painting Jesus in their own image. They were imposing their ideals, ethics, and theology onto Jesus. What scholars are discovering, however, is that Jesus is best understood and studied in his first century Jewish context. To quote a New Testament scholar, Craig Keener, he says, "Indeed, If we are interested in the Jesus who lived and died in first century Galilee, we would do better to read him in the very context that the Reich Church, the church of the Nazi Party, most abhorred, Jesus' Judaism. Karen Zetterholm, she says, at present, virtually all scholars view Jesus as firmly rooted in Judaism, and his message is part of the multifaceted Second Temple Judaism.
So let me get this straight. Many of the scholars who took all of the evidence of Jesus' Jewishness and threw it out, they were German scholars who were living before World War II, before the Holocaust, and were oftentimes members of the Reich Church. Do you think that they maybe had some motivation to get rid of any Jewishness on Jesus' account?
Yeah, I think we can definitely see that. And I think that the criticism that Schweitzer gave in 1906, that, yeah, scholars paint Jesus really in their own image. And it's really scary what can happen and why scholarship is so important on Jesus, because it can create Jesus into literally painting him as a Nazi. And today, when we look, what you mentioned at the beginning, Brian, about October 7th and how people are taking Jesus and trying to make him their champion, even a Palestinian. So what we're talking about today on this episode is really, really significant, understanding Jesus in his first century context as a Jew, and not to paint him into our own image. I mean, of course, I'm Jewish, but I see him in the way the text explicitly says that he is, as I know what all of you all are going to share with us later.
So it would sound like people who deny Jesus' Jewishness today or want to sideline it, maybe say that he was the creation of some later Greek-infused mythology, that perhaps those very people who are perpetuating those ideas today are actually descendants and listening to the influence of Nazi scholarship from 100 years ago. That's no good. That is no good.
Not at all.
Okay, so Jonathan, you mentioned that developments in the study of the complexity and the diversity of Second Temple Judaism has contributed to the historical Jesus as belonging within Judaism. So what are some of those developments? Can you unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. So what scholars call Second Temple Judaism, it really describes Judaism that existed between the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple in 516 BCE and its destruction in 70 CE by the Romans. Judaism is the ways of life of the Jewish people. And I didn't say the way of life, but the ways of life, because there were many Jewish groups that had both agreement and diversity in theology and practice. They had disagreements on the afterlife, on resurrection, Sabbath observance, purity laws, the coming of the Messiah, or even a couple Messiahs, the efficacy of the temple sacrifices, the traditions of the fathers, the oral law, among other areas of Jewish belief and practice. So while there were many Jewish groups during the Second Temple period, most Jews were not even members of any one of these groups. There was much diversity within the Jewish world that Jesus lived in. And scholars who study this diversity in Judaism, they study it from Jewish sources, such as the Greek translation of the Tanakh called the Septuagint, or commentaries on the Tanakh like Jubilees or Philo's works, wisdom writings like the Wisdom of Solomon, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Jewish historian Josephus, the Maccabean literature, First Maccabees, Fourth Maccabees, Second Maccabees, the Mishnah, Jewish apocalyptic literature such as Enoch and Fourth Ezra. There is a vast array, a library of Jewish writings that contribute to understanding Jesus' world, which is Second Temple Judaism. So Judaism is not the background of Jesus. Jesus doesn't have Jewish roots. He belongs within it. We can both understand Jesus' life and teachings when we see that the historical Jesus fits within his Jewish world. We can even locate many of Jesus' teachings in other Jewish literature, and this Jewish literature can also provide clarity and context to his teachings. The biographies of Jesus, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel according to Matthew, Luke, and John, these are first century biographies of Jesus. Jesus is the one proclaiming the good news. This is what gospel means, the good news. And Jesus is proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. And each of these first century Jewish authors who are writing their biography, a genre that existed at the time within Jewish literature, they're writing biographies of Yeshua's life, teachings, death, and resurrection. To put it simply, these Gospels are ancient Jewish texts that contribute to our understanding of Second Temple Judaism broadly and the historical Jesus specifically. I actually went to a conference called the Society of Biblical Literature Conference back, I think it was 2019, and there was a session that had a Jewish scholar by the name of Daniel Boyarin who was speaking on a panel. People filled this room. I was actually sitting on the floor, and I listened to his talk, and he said this. He said, Jews frequently complain that Christians have hijacked the Old Testament from us. It's the New Testament that's been hijacked. All of those texts can productively be read as part of Jewish history.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for giving us that great background on the Jewish world that Jesus was not just having as a background, but he actually lived in it. And so that's a really good segue now to transition to our next question, which is now going to be for Eric to share about. What can we glean from the New Testament about Jesus' Jewish lifestyle? Put more succinctly, how did he live and act, and how does that actually show that he lived as a member of the Jewish world within the Jewish world?
Sure, yeah, those are great questions. So first, I kind of would like to frame this almost in some ways that we think about Jewish identity and living a Jewish life today. Some Jews, they engage primarily with Jewish life and expressing their Jewish identity through religion, so praying from the Siddur, doing mitzvot. Others, they primarily express their Jewish identity through Zionism or even just living in the land of Israel. Even as a secular Jew, they'll feel very Jewish and be recognized as very Jewish simply because they live in Israel, live in the land, and speak the language. Then there's other Jewish people, especially in America, where their primary engagement and expression of Jewish identity is through Jewish culture. So kind of a sense of peoplehood and doing cultural traditions that maybe are religious, but for them it's more of a cultural thing. So I was wondering if maybe we could kind of map on even today's notions of expression of Jewish life and Jewish identity onto a reading of the Gospels and see if Jesus fulfills each one of those things. Because even though those are kind of a modern way of articulating it, those pillars of Jewish life existed back then. Back then, it was more intertwined. They all related to each other. They're all intertwined with one another. They're not so separated like today, but let's see if Jesus engaged with Jewish life in each of those spheres and dimensions. So we can start with the religious dimension, the religious ways of life, as Jonathan put it. And so first, very beginning, Jesus had very good Jewish parents, and they did a brit milah for him. They circumcised him on the 8th day, entering him into the covenant of Abraham and of the Jewish people. We see that in Luke 2:21. It's actually the earliest account of a Jewish boy receiving his name publicly for the first time at his brit milah. That's a Jewish tradition where this is actually the earliest account of that we have, which is pretty cool. We see that Yeshua, he also wore tzitzit. Matthew, Mark, and Luke note this. One example is in Mark 6:46. Mark says, "They laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well." So Mark, writing in Greek, he uses the word krospedon, there for fringe, and that's the same word the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Torah, of the Tanakh, use in Numbers 15 to refer to tzitzit. So we know Yeshua wore tzitzit because of what Mark says here in chapter 6. And then, of course, Yeshua went to the synagogue on Shabbat. Luke 13:10 says now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. And this was a common occurrence. Jesus said in John 18:20, Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together." So Yeshua was even teaching in the temple, the center of Jewish life in Israel. And then we can also infer that Jesus kept kosher. So in Acts 10, so this is years after the crucifixion and resurrection, Peter said, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." So this implies Yeshua taught and set the example of keeping kosher during his life, because Peter, being one of his close disciples, would have been following the teachings and the example of Yeshua. And then we see that Yeshua respected and taught others to follow the temple protocols. So we have this really cool story in Luke 5 where Yeshua is healing, and he heals a man with leprosy. And after this healing and he's made clean, Luke 5 verse 14 says, "Then Jesus ordered him, 'Don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them.'" So he was a good Torah teacher and instructed the man who he healed to go to the temple and follow the protocols that come after having leprosy. And then a really great example of Yeshua's expression of Jewish religion is that he expressed the Shema. In Mark 12, he was asked what is the most important commandment, and Jesus answered, "The most important is, 'Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength.' And then the second is like this, 'You shall love your neighbor as yourself.' There's no other commandment greater than these." So we see Yeshua answered with the Shema, the V'ahavta, and then "You shall love your neighbor as yourself" from Leviticus 19. So Yeshua was very much engaged in a Jewish religious way of life.
It's pretty amazing that right there in the text of the Gospels, you've got Yeshua quoting the Shema and saying, this is the greatest commandment, this is the greatest thing that I as a Jew need to recognize. I don't know if many people are familiar, especially Jewish people, are familiar that the New Testament includes the Shema within it. I know that the Shema is very important in Judaism, but is there any other reason why Jesus saying the Shema is so significant for understanding who he is in the Gospels?
Yeah, so reciting the Shema within Judaism isn't merely quoting Deuteronomy 6:4 as an important scripture, or even necessarily simply a declaration of a belief that you have about God being the only God. But in Judaism, especially in early Mishnaic Judaism, just a couple hundred years later, we see the recitation of the Shema is actually also a commitment, a vocal commitment to observe the Torah and to follow God. Technically, it's called the acceptance of the yoke of the kingdom of heaven and accepting the yoke of all the commandments. And I think Yeshua is expressing a bit of a notion of this because he's answering the question, what is the most important commandment? And he answers with the Shema. So it's not simply a declaration of theological belief, but as a commitment to obey what is taught in the Torah. And if there's any other confirmation for that, Yeshua teaches very clearly in Matthew 5:17 through 18 what he believes about the Torah. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished." So like any good Jew, he was very committed to a life of Torah and of obeying what God taught. So that is the religious dimension of Yeshua's life that we see emphasized in the Gospels. And then the next is the land. So Yeshua, he was born in Bethlehem, in Israel, and lived almost his whole life in Israel, in Nazareth and around the Galilee, and he frequently made trips to Jerusalem for the holidays and other things. He was what we call today a Sabra. He was a native-born Israeli. And then for the final dimension, we have Jewish culture, so that's kind of peoplehood and language. And Jen will talk more about peoplehood later and Yeshua's perspective on being part of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people. But a few notes on it. He had 2 Jewish parents. He considered the Jewish people his people, and all of his closest friends were Jewish. So he is hanging around Jewish people all the time, every day. And with that comes participating in Jewish cultural ways of life. This is something where we do get a little anachronistic. There wasn't a distinction between culture and religion back then in the first century like we have today. But just like today, where Jewish people will engage in their Jewish identity through the traditions, we see Yeshua doing the same thing. So just for a few quick examples, one, in his celebration of Passover, he wasn't simply doing what the Torah strictly instructed, but he engaged in traditional things like the Seder, that included ceremonial cups of wine, doing blessings before matzah in the wine, and sitting and reclining, and even singing songs after the Seder, which we read about in Matthew 26 and Luke 22. And then also we see Yeshua celebrated Hanukkah in John 10 at the temple. So then the final thing is language. So Yeshua knew Hebrew and Aramaic.
Wait a second. Hebrew, how do you know that he knew Hebrew and Aramaic? Because the New Testament was written in Greek, right? How do we know that he didn't speak in Greek?
That's a really good question. First of all, he probably did speak in Greek. Greek was the lingua franca. It was the common tongue of the Roman Empire. Like English today, English is known all around the world. Greek was similarly that kind of language in the Roman Empire. But we know he didn't only speak Greek. We can infer some things from the text here. Of course, there's just kind of background knowledge of knowing that Aramaic was the common tongue of the Jewish people at the time. So considering Yeshua was a Sabra, it just increases the probability that that is a language he also knew, is most likely the case. But we also have some more explicit evidence in the Gospels. So one, we know that he understood Hebrew because he read from the prophets in synagogue. So in Luke 4:16, we see that Luke says, "And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him." And then he goes on to read from Isaiah 61. So there we see Yeshua reading vocally from the Hebrew scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue. So we also know that Yeshua spoke Aramaic, and one of the reasons why we know that is because of what is written in Matthew 27:46. So the scene here is that Yeshua is being crucified, and some of his final words are Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani. And then Matthew actually translates it in the text. He says, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? So lema sabachthani is Aramaic, and Matthew actually preserves this. Even in the Greek, he does it in transliteration. And here's a note written by Aaron Gale in the Jewish Annotated New Testament. So he's a Jewish scholar. And this is his note on this verse. He says the first two words, Eli, Eli, are in Hebrew, possibly to recall the familiar Hebrew psalm, followed by Aramaic, the vernacular of the period. The psalm, which informs much of the description of the crucifixion, ends on a triumphal note. So even just from this one verse, we see that Yeshua spoke Aramaic. And then in the version in Mark, Eli, Eli is actually in the Aramaic there instead of the Hebrew. So all in all, we see that Jesus lived a very Jewish life in many different ways. I think Dr. Amy Jo Levine, a Jewish scholar who studies the life of Jesus, puts it very well in her book called The Misunderstood Jew. She says, Jesus of Nazareth dressed like a Jew, prayed like a Jew, and most likely in Aramaic, instructed other Jews on how best to live according to the commandments given by God to Moses, taught like a Jew, argued like a Jew with other Jews. Jesus' earliest followers were, like Jesus himself, Jews.
Well said. Great way to end your section on Jesus' Jewish life, Eric. Thank you very much for that. And so now I would like to jump in here, and I'd like to transition and talk about Jesus' Jewish worldview. What is a worldview? A worldview is the sum total of your beliefs, your thoughts, your knowledge, and how that informs your way of life. So Eric just talked about Jesus' Jewish way of life, but the worldview is what gives meaning and gives purpose and orders your life. Why is it that Jesus lived in such a Jewish way? It's partially because he grew up in a Jewish context as a Jewish man, but also he had a Jewish worldview. It's the way that he viewed the world as a Jewish man. His teachings were saturated with the Tanakh, and that shows that his thoughts were saturated with the Tanakh. And I think there's a really good example of this in Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is out in the desert and he is tempted by the devil. And there are 3 times that the devil comes up to him and attempts to tempt him to sin in some way. When things are tough, when you've got a difficult situation like being tempted by the devil, That's when your true character shines out. And every time that Jesus is tempted in Matthew chapter 4, he responds by quoting from the Torah. He responds with Deuteronomy. He uses the text of the Torah to rebuke the devil and to tell him no. And this is just the opening scene of Jesus's life as an adult before he's beginning his teaching ministry. And as he goes forward from there, he quotes from the Tanakh all over his sermons. He is just saturated in the Tanakh. And I think this really shines through in his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, which starts just the next chapter in Matthew chapter 5. And if you've never read it before, I would encourage you to read it and think about Pirkei Avot. Think about the ethics of the fathers as you are reading the Sermon on the Mount, because there are so many similarities between the ethics of the sages and the ethics of Yeshua. And it's like the Sermon on the Mount is one big drosh on the Torah. He's just explaining the Torah from his own perspective, and he is saying that he has come to actually fulfill the Torah. And that's something that Eric mentioned before, that he did not come to abolish the Torah, but to fulfill it. And that's how he starts out his sermon, but then he goes on. He talks about multiple mitzvot in the 10 Commandments or the 10 words. He quotes from the Torah when it comes to murder and adultery. He talks about not bearing false witness through oaths. These are all huge categories in Jewish law and Jewish practice. He deals with a lot of other mitzvot as well. He talks about giving tzedakah. He instructs his disciples how to pray. He instructs them how to fast in the right way, how to fast in the wrong way. And he also describes how to act as judges. And judgment and acting as judges is a big part of the Torah. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, even just right there in and of itself, it is a very Jewish sermon. But he taught on all kinds of other things, even beyond his Sermon on the Mount. He taught a lot on halakha, and he entered into halakhic disputes with those around him. Now, there's a lot of talk in the Talmud about the most important commandments. And if you go to the Babylonian Talmud in Makot 24a, you'll see that there's this discussion among the sages trying to whittle down the 613 mitzvot to the most important. And so they start with 613, and they say, then David came and he whittled it down to a smaller number. Then Isaiah came and he whittled it down to a smaller number. Then they finally get to the last one, and they say, there's one place in the Tanakh where one verse, it actually describes and accounts for the entire Torah. And they say that is Habakkuk 2 verse 4, where it says, the righteous shall live by faith. So this idea of needing to whittle down all the complexity of the Torah down to its core, its essence, that is a very Jewish thing to do. And Habakkuk 2:4, it's actually a stronger case for the Jewishness of Paul, Jesus' apostle, because he talks a lot about the righteous shall live by faith. But I bring that up just to show that it's a Jewish conversation to try to figure out what the essence of the Torah is. And Yeshua gave an essence of the Torah himself. He said that the greatest commandment is the Shema. And we heard that from Eric, but I just want to reiterate that again, that if you're going to pick any passage of the Torah and say this is the most important, the safest Jewish answer is to say it's the Shema. And that's exactly what Yeshua did. But then he goes on from there and he says that the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. So the greatest commandment is the Shema, which includes love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the second greatest commandment is love your neighbor as yourself. And even the most skeptical people who just don't care anything about Jesus or what he taught, if you know the Torah and you look at it through those two commandments being the most important, I think that even the biggest skeptic is going to have to acknowledge, yeah, I think those two commandments, they account for quite a bit in the Torah. And that shows Jesus' brilliance in understanding what the Torah is all about. Another thing that Yeshua did is he really stressed teshuvah. He stressed repentance. Sure, we've got all these laws that we need to follow. We need to love God. We need to love our neighbors. But what do we do when we mess up? And he didn't just say you can just get off the hook. That's not a Jewish way to do it. He says we need to repent, both to God and to our fellow human beings. Yeshua also took sides on internal Jewish controversies. And two examples are found in a single chapter in Matthew chapter 22. There was a current controversy in the first century about whether the Jewish people who were living under Roman occupation should pay taxes to a government that is oppressing them, of course, the Romans. And so they came up to Jesus and they tried to trap him because there's really no good answer. If he says, yes, you should pay taxes to Caesar, then that makes it sound like he is in cahoots with Rome. And if he says, no, don't pay taxes to Caesar, then his opponents can say he's leading a political uprising and we should get rid of him. And what does Yeshua do? Well, you'll have to read the text for yourself, but he basically finds a way that nobody can disagree with him. He also took sides by rejecting the Sadducees and their denial of the resurrection. Now, we don't know if it is right to say that Jesus was part of any particular Jewish sect in the first century, but by rejecting the Sadducees because of their denial of the resurrection, he places himself solidly in the realm of the Pharisees and the Essenes. Now, that doesn't mean that we can call him a part of those groups in the first century, but it's very clear that he was not a part of the Sadducees, and so he took sides against them in that dispute. He also taught very important moral principle using parables. It's one thing to teach, you shall do this and you shall not do that. That's a very Torah-centric way of giving commandments, but anyone who's read Hasidut knows the power of parables to explain the ethics and the core of Judaism to the heart and the mind. There's a way that parables, that stories, that analogies, they just bring the heart of the Torah out. And Yeshua is known for his parables all throughout the Gospels. And I just want to bring up one that is just so valued and so prized by people who love Jesus' parables. And that's in Luke chapter 15. It's the parable of the prodigal son. And it's the story of a Jewish man who squanders his inheritance, goes and runs off to the land of the Gentiles, spends his money in wild living, and then he recognizes that he had sinned against his father by squandering the inheritance, even asking for his inheritance before his father was dead. That's another big no-no. And he repents of his sin and decides to come back to his father, and he's going to grovel and he's going to repent and dust and ashes, and he is just going to ask to just be a nobody in his father's household because he recognizes that it's better to be a slave in his father's house than it is to be broke out with the Gentiles living a horrible life. But the point of the parable is not to focus on the son. The point of the parable is to focus on the extravagant love of the father who runs to his son and accepts him with open arms. Now, it's one thing to say, God loves you. It's another thing to share a story like this, like Yeshua does, and vividly depict the love of God for someone who repents of their sin. All of these examples show that Jesus is thinking in Jewish ways, he's teaching in Jewish ways, because he's living in a Jewish world. He is a Jew, and that is just the way that he lives. So we've been talking about how Jesus sees himself as a Jewish man because he is a Jewish man. He lives a Jewish lifestyle. He has a Jewish worldview. But how does he actually view himself in relation to his fellow Jewish people? How does he show his love for his own people? And so I'd like to give that question to you, Jen. How did Jesus show his love for his Jewish people in his life and in his ministry?
Thanks, Brian. Well, first, I want to point out that as we've all talked about here so far, Brian, Eric, and Jonathan, that Jesus was a Jewish man. He came to his people, Israel, to his own people, the Jewish people. That's what I would say as point number one. And specifically in Matthew 15, Jesus' Jewish apostle, Matthew, he records a story where a Gentile woman comes up to Jesus and she begs him to heal her demon-possessed child. And Jesus, surprisingly, when you're reading that, he answers her, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So he was saying, basically, you're a Gentile woman. I came here to love and serve my people Israel. And she continues to beg the Lord to please heal her child. And of course, Jesus, out of his love, heals her son as well. But it's pointed that he pointed out that he came only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. His ministry was Israel first, was the Jewish people first. And this was in fulfillment of what the Hebrew scriptures prophesied of the Messiah, that he would be a descendant of King David. He would be from the tribe of Judah. He would come to his own people. And as some have pointed out already, all of Jesus's family, his friends, his close-knit group of people, his disciples, they were all Jewish. And we see his love specifically toward the outcasts of Israeli society. Jesus loved and healed lepers who, according to the Torah, had to remain separate from the rest of the Jewish people because they had a very contagious skin disease. Imagine the loneliness of these people knowing that there was no cure. And Jesus, we see him healing these lepers and reaching down to them in their despair and healing them. We see him healing the blind. The blind were able to then see again. The deaf he allowed to hear again. He healed the demon-possessed. The paralyzed walked again. He healed everyone who came to him who was sick. And all again in fulfillment of what the Hebrew scriptures said the ministry of the Messiah would entail. It would be one marked by miracles and healing. Specifically, the prophet Isaiah in chapter 35, verses 5 and 6, he wrote, "The eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy." He spoke this of the day of Israel's salvation, and that's how he described it would look. And that's exactly what we see Yeshua doing throughout the New Testament. We see him loving and forgiving sinners who also were viewed as outcasts of religious society. In Matthew 9, verses 10 to 12, again, Jesus' Jewish apostle Matthew records, "And as Yeshua reclined at the table in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, 'Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?' But when Jesus heard it, he said, 'Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance.'" So Jesus made it a point in his life and service to the Jewish people to likewise reach out to the sinners, the outcasts of Jewish religious society.
Jen, I'm really struck by how you started your response here, just really emphasizing that Jesus said that he came only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he's saying that to a Gentile woman, basically saying, my mission was not to come for you, even though he eventually healed that woman. And it seems to me that the Jewish apostles, Jesus' followers, after his death and resurrection, when they went out on their own teaching trips going all over the Roman Empire, they seemed to follow that a similar method of reaching Jewish people first. Not saying that they didn't go to Gentiles. They obviously did go to Gentiles as well, but they really emphasized getting to the Jewish people first.
Exactly. We see this especially in the life of the Apostle Paul. God called him to reach Gentiles with the gospel of the Jewish Messiah coming to save his people from their sins. And even though he was specifically called to the Gentiles, in every city he went, Paul first went to the synagogues and shared the good news with his fellow Jewish people. And then in Romans 1:16, Paul wrote, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek or Gentile." So this was the style of Jesus's Jewish apostles and their ministry. They first wanted to reach their fellow Jewish people with the gospel, and they shared it to the Jew first and then to the Gentile.
Thanks, Jen. So we've been talking a lot about how Jesus' Jewish life was just saturated in first century Jewish context, but I want to talk a little bit about how his death actually shows his love for Jewish people. Typically, we see the symbol of the cross, the Roman execution stake that he was murdered on, he was executed on. And we see that as a symbol, perhaps, of the Christian church. But oftentimes Jewish people look at the cross and they don't see it as a symbol of love. They see it as a symbol that has been used for persecution and anti-Semitism over church history. But that's not how it began, right? How does Jesus' death on that cross actually show his love for his Jewish people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love what John says in chapter 15, verse 13. Jesus is Jewish apostle John. He says, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends." So Yeshua's ultimate love for his people Israel, for the Jewish people, yes, was in his life and ministry, but more so even in his death. The New Testament makes clear that no one took Jesus's life from him. He chose to lay it down of his own free will. Jesus chose to be the sacrificial, atoning sin offering for Israel's sins, for his Jewish people's sins. And we see this prophesied by the prophet Isaiah, the Jewish prophet Isaiah in chapter 53. And I encourage our listeners to go read it. It's a great chapter that foreshadows the love of the coming Messiah and his sacrificial death for his people. I'll just here read a couple verses for time's sake. But Isaiah writes, "Surely he, the suffering servant, has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we, Isaiah's Jewish people, esteemed him, the suffering servant, stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted." And that's exactly what we see for those Jewish people who did call for his crucifixion. Many believed in him and some did not. And those that did not viewed Jesus's crucifixion as he was being punished by God for lies, for claiming to be something he was not. And that's exactly also what Isaiah prophesied, that the people of Israel would look at him as smitten by God and afflicted. But he goes on to say, "He was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray, and we have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So the prophet Isaiah wrote this 700 years before Jesus would ever walk the earth, but he already prophesied of how Yeshua would love his Jewish people in his death. And Yeshua was also dying for the sins of the world, but like we said, ultimately, he came first to his people Israel, and then likewise to save the Gentiles as well.
Beautiful. Love it, Jen. But that's not the end of the story, right? We've just been talking about things that happened 2,000 years ago. But the story of the New Testament, the story of what the New Testament teaches about Jesus, it doesn't end there. It says that the Messiah will return, that he will come back again, and that he has some unfinished business with his Jewish people when he returns. So, can you unpack that a little bit for us? How will Jesus in the future show a special love to Israel when he returns?
Yes. So in the New Testament, we see that Jesus, in his return, also, he returns to Israel, to his Jewish people. When prophesying about this return to Israel after his death and resurrection, Jesus used this imagery to say that at his first coming, he wanted to gather Israel as a hen gathers her chicks. He loved them so much and wanted to gather them under his wings. But Israel was not ready at his first coming. But they will be ready at his second coming to receive him as king. So Yeshua prophesied this in Matthew 23. We read in verses 37 to 39. Yeshua cries out, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord.'" So we see here, Jesus is prophesying that He had this love for his Jewish people at his first coming, but they will finally receive him at his second coming. And they will be in Jerusalem and they will be crying out, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." They will recognize Jesus as their Messiah. And I also love what the prophet Zechariah says in chapter 10, because it's actually Jesus speaking in this passage. And he says in Zechariah 12, 9 through 10, "In that day, I, Yeshua, will set about to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son." So similar to what Yeshua said in Matthew 23, the Jewish people are back in the land, they're in Jerusalem, and they're welcoming Jesus as their Messiah. Zechariah in chapter 12 prophesied this when Yeshua says, at his return, he will show his love for Israel in his defense of them against their enemies. And we could see that happening today, as it has been all throughout history. The Jewish people are hated by many. And that will continue, unfortunately, until the return of Yeshua, when the nations are gathered around Israel, wanting to destroy the Jewish people. And they cry out to Yeshua as their Messiah, and he returns and he defends the Jewish people from their enemies. It says that in this passage that God will pour out his spirit on them so they can recognize him as their Messiah and King. And then he will reign from his rightful throne in Jerusalem forevermore.
Love it. Thank you, Jen. And of course, that is something that we look forward to. We look forward to the salvation of all Israel when Jesus returns. But we also remember that there is a remnant. There is a remnant today. There are Jewish people who are alive today who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They are simultaneously believers in Jesus and they are members of Israel. They have not left their people. They have not left their tradition. They have not left the covenant. And of course, we have here with us today Eric and Jonathan as two examples of that Jewish remnant. And so all of this is just a beautiful reminder of how Jewish Jesus is. And that is how we started this conversation today. We asked the question, is Jesus Jewish? And the answer is a resounding yes. We learned that he lived a Jewish lifestyle in a Jewish context in the land of Israel. We learned that he has a Jewish worldview. And we also learned that modern scholars are recognizing that you can't just throw all that stuff out simply because it sounds so Jewish, as if Jewishness is not authentic when it comes to Jesus. And how modern scholars, looking at the true historical Jesus, are reminding themselves and defending how Jesus is Jewish. And so that's what we did here today. That's what we will do on this channel from here on out. And I would encourage all of those who had perhaps a different understanding of Jesus before you started listening to this to really think back as to where you got your understanding of Jesus before this. Because when we ignore or deny Jesus' Jewishness, we end up making Jesus into our own image. And that's not a good thing to be doing. And so if you enjoyed this conversation, I would encourage you to like and to subscribe to this channel. And we are going to be having lots more conversations just along these lines, talking about the Jewishness of the New Testament, the Jewishness of Jesus, the Jewishness of the gospel, and how all of this is a part of taking the good news of Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. Thanks so much for joining us, and shalom.